thought I would start and let you know who I am. I'm Jonathan David Baird. Um, I this topic was my thesis for my master's in English literature. I'm currently working on my PhD, but that's in American history. I also have a master's in American history and an MFA in writing. So I know a little bit about Darwin. I also worked as an archaeologist for 20 years. And Darwin was always, on our mind. And his theory changed the world. Whether you want to believe in Darwin's, theory of evolution or not, that doesn't have any impact on how it changed everything. So, you could go into this conversation not believing in evolution, not believing in Darwin's theory, and still understand that the theory itself changed how people wrote. It changed how the future, the science fiction and horror itself totally changed after the advent of Darwin's theory, and it's important to note that. And I think that once you see how it impacted these different writers we're going to talk about in this lecture, you'll see that this was really important, and a lot of the um, science fiction and fantasy and horror we have today really is settled on a foundation of Darwin's theory of evolution. So let's get into this and start talking about some of these important aspects of the theory and how the theory changed everything. And here it is, The Origin of Species. This is Darwin's crowning achievement. The book that changed the world, and it changed the world in many ways. And it actually introduced the world in some ways to the scientific method. His people, it's not like the theory of evolution of natural selection hadn't already sort of been in the zeitgeist. By the 1830s, I think people like Charles Darwin and other scientists had been toying with, ideas about natural selection. But it wasn't until Darwin really sat down and published this book that it was all in one place and that it could really, be grasped by, ordinary people. The book is not, the book is written on a level that it really did become a popular book in of itself. In 1859, 1860s, by the 1880s, this book was everywhere. This book really was foundational to science. Within 20 years, this book was foundational to every aspect of science, and it caused a sea change in how people thought about science. Darwin himself, Darwin was had been a religious man, and it makes a lot of difference in how people think about their religion, and it changes how people think about society in general. And we look at people like T.H. Huxley, who was called Darwin's bulldog. Huxley went out and founded societies in which promoted, the origin of species and promoted evolutionary theory. I think people like Huxley and H.G. Wells, we're going to talk about H.G. Wells later, went a little far because they start this whole idea of social Darwinism, and Darwin had no real truck with this whole social Darwinist idea, but certainly other people saw that in the origin of species. But if we think about how the origin of species changed society, the idea of natural selection changing species and the different species, it will have a change in how everything, especially literature and fantasy literature, Gothic literature, science fiction, it really impacts that, because this is like, the very essence of how people view the world, and the origin of species is so important for that, and you're going to see when we look at some of these authors here that their works were totally transformed. It destroyed, not didn't destroy, but it changed. There are some very important works here that are totally changed by the origin of species being published. And we're going to see that here in a little bit. One of the most important facts about this is that the origin of species permeated almost every level of society. So that's why it's so important in literature. And in literature, it gets presented to the public through literature, and then later films and that sort of thing. But here in the beginning, you're going to have a lot of authors that grab this theory and they're going to run with it, and they're going to really do some important work that becomes a popular fiction. And this popular fiction sort of propagates the ideas of Darwin across the entire spectrum of society. Herbert George Wells. Now, this man is probably I would say, the most important person in propagating Darwin's theory through literature. And no one can doubt his importance in science fiction. He's also really important in Gothic horror. And one of the reasons I call this Gothic horror, the idea of science fiction hadn't really solidified in the way you would think it would. So Wells is really writing in this Gothic horror tradition. Even though his ideas are science fiction, they're also horror stories. Almost all of them are horror stories. If you look at, we're going to look at the Island of Dr Moreau here in a moment, as his most important tale of evolution. But I mean, that is definitely a horror story. What Wells really delved into was psychological horror. He has aspects of his horror deal with the how society, there's a rot within society, or there's something within society that's horrifying. He really delves into this idea of the stranger and the foreigner. I mean, in today's world, we would say this is sort of racist, but we're talking about culturally foreign elements coming into society, and that's, you'll see that throughout his work. But Wells was also a huge fan. He was a friend of T.H. Huxley. He belonged to many of these societies that were promoting Darwinism, and he becomes a Fabian socialist. And the Fabian socialists believed that society could be changed through a sort of a Darwinian process, and he really pushed the idea of social change, evolutionary social changes. And so, social Darwinism really a lot of it springs from H.G. Wells. If we look at books like The Time Machine, and The Time Machine is a great example of social Darwinism, because it even goes beyond Darwinism, because the Eloi and the Morlocks evolve their positions in this social dynamic. The Morlocks become this overlord, quasi-human group that live underground and prey upon the Eloi, who are these perfect angelic, maybe Fae. Fae may be the perfect. Actually, you can look at it in terms of that as well, that these almost perfect little beings exist, and they're being preyed upon by these monsters that live underground. But to get to this point, 800,000 years from now, when Wells' protagonist arrives, they have evolved to this point. And what we're looking at is how, the Wells is trying to show this evolution of society. And then, of course, it's a horror story. This is a horror story, The Time Machine. Almost everything Wells writes is really a horror story. But, he wants to show you how Darwinism can go wrong in this story, and that happens quite a bit in his work. He is a proponent of Darwinism, but he really likes to show how it can go wrong. The Island of Dr. Moreau is probably while it isn't evolution in fact, he is using the ideas, this scientific idea that lower creatures can become higher creatures. and he doesn't he has to speed it up, and of course Wells can't figure out. Wells knows it takes millions of years for creatures to evolve, so he's using this idea of vivisection, changing things while they're still alive, but to speed up evolution. And he really uses this to great effect in the Island of Dr. Moreau, because you're throwing off the idea of, you know, monsters, normal monsters. We come to, there's monsters everywhere, hiding under the beds. But in the Island of Dr. Moreau, the monster is not the creatures on the island. The monster is man. And that's one of the important things about this story. The creatures that live on the island are animals, and they are acting as animals, even though they're given higher thought processes. They're given the bodies of men. The real monster is the scientist who is creating these monstrosities. And in a lot of ways, we get to the end of this book, and the end of this book is one of the most important parts of this book, because at the end of the book, the protagonist, and I forget his name right at this moment, he realizes that the beast lives within him. Even though he is a human, the beasts are in his soul. That as a human, he is still part of the natural world. He at any time could become a beast. And he's in London again at the end of the book, and he's looking around and he sees all these people. And he's like, how many of these people have this beast within them? And he realizes it's everyone. That civilization is just this veneer. That being, human is a veneer, because any one of us can become a beast at any time. And that is the existential horror of the Island of Dr. Moreau. It doesn't have anything to do with whether you've created beasts out of a dog, or out of a wolf, or a tiger, and you create a human, like half human, half tiger. Those aren't the beasts. Those are unfortunates. Humanity itself is a beast, because humanity is only a veneer on the surface. Something that has only occurred in the last few years, and in a lot of ways, Wells is digging deeply into Darwinian theory to create this Island of Dr. Moreau book, because he's thinking about the millions of years of evolution, millions of years when humans were beasts, were apes, and just the few thousand years where humans have now come into this idea of civilized behavior. And how that civilized behavior is so ephemeral compared to the millions of years of evolution, of being a monster, not a monster, but a beast of the field. And I see a lot of similarities between the Island of Dr. Moreau and later on Planet of the Apes. The very idea that the beast is within, and instead of being without, and Wells really touches on it in this book. It's in my opinion, it's one of Wells's best book novels. I think a lot of ways people I think consider War of the Worlds or The Time Machine as being higher caliber novels. I think they're just more well known. I think the Island of Dr. Moreau is his absolute best work, because I think it has more of the existential horror than either of the other two. I mean, War of the Worlds is interesting, and he does have a Darwinian perspective in that novel as well, because the creatures, the Martians, are killed by bacteria, and we're survival of the fittest. Survival of the fittest runs throughout a lot of Wells' works, and you can see it really well in that, because the humans were more fit, not because they were more evolved than the creatures from Mars. They're more fit because they fit into the evolutionary niche of Earth. And Wells is playing with Darwinian theory here as well. And you can see it directly. You can see the direct impact of Darwin on Island of Dr. Moreau, The Time Machine, the War of the Worlds. In fact, you can see it in the impact on lots of Wells's work. And you probably did not expect to see Bram Stoker here. And Dracula is an important late Victorian novel. I think it was published in 1896, but it had been in the newspapers as a serialized book a year or two before. It really did not become the bestseller that we think of until 1912. There was another book called The Beetle, and The Beetle outsold Dracula until up until 1912. It was the bestseller. And The Beetle is a little known book today, and it doesn't have as much to do with Darwin as say Dracula. When I explained how Dracula does have an important part of to play in this, but I do suggest you go look up The Beetle and read that. It's a really good book. It is more. It involves the New Woman feminist movement of the late Victorian era, and it also has a lot to do about transsexuality, which is really interesting. A book basically centering around transsexuals in the late Victorian era, and was probably the best-selling fiction in the late Victorian era. But let's get back to Bram Stoker. Bram Stoker, educated man, he knew about Darwin's theories, and he utilizes ideas from the theory within Dracula. And the way he uses, Darwin in Dracula is because the ideas of Darwin have become so by the 1890s when Dracula was written. Dracula is not like other earlier vampire stories. Dracula, the novel, and we don't see this as much, when you watch Dr. Van Helsing type things, where in our modern conception, you don't see the painstaking scientific study, almost detective level study within Dracula, but it's there. If you read the novel, you'll obviously see these things, that these people that are trying to unearth the secret of Dracula are going about it in a scientific manner, and that is because Bram Stoker has been, by the 1890s, totally inundated in this idea of Darwin and science and the scientific method. And here we are, we're trying to look at a vampire through the lens of science. How do we look at a fantastic monster, a monster that could not exist, but we want to look at it through a lens of science? We look at the blood, we study, the minute details of what the vampire is doing, and it's really interesting. The book is more interesting than almost any of the lore that has come out about it afterwards. You almost always just push aside this systematic study of the vampire that's within the book, and look at this the sexuality of the vampire and all these other things. But you have to realize there was a core of science within. Dracula is almost a science fiction novel, even though it's a horror novel. It's almost a science fiction novel because we are trying to dissect the fantastic, dissect the superstitious with science. And that would not have happened in this novel had Darwin not changed the way people looked at the world. And people are trying to look at the world with a more scientific view. And that's why, that's why Van Helsing is so important in the book. And that's how they come to find ways to defeat the vampire by the end, is through this method. And it's really, this is how we see that Stoker was so changed by Darwin. And I add him in here mainly because he's interesting, and Dracula is such a huge, cultural touchstone. But also because, a vampire is almost like another evolutionary, part of humanity. It's an offshoot of humanity in some ways, and we don't see that in a lot of works. And I think that you see this this scientific vampire later on. Certainly, today we see scientific vampires quite often in fiction. But Stoker was the first one to really touch on that. And there's lots of other vampire stories. And if you think about it, why is Dracula with Varney the vampire, the vampire? There are lots of Victorian vampire stories. Why does this one stand out? And I think it stands out because it captured, the essence of what the late Victorians thought about science as well as superstition. So, Arthur Conan Doyle, you may not know this, he was profoundly impacted by Darwin's theories. And what is funny is that he really rejected a lot of the scientific theories later in some of his later works because he had been fooled by several he was fooled by the fairy pictures, which I don't know how any adult was fooled by the fairy pictures, but he was. He believed in seances, that sort of thing. The man that created Sherlock Holmes was not the most logical human being that ever lived. While he created one of the most logical characters in fiction, he really did rail against some of the archaeologists, anthropologists of his day, and you would think, the man that was so anti-science in some ways would not be impacted by Darwin's theories, but Doyle was very much involved in this, in the theory of evolution. One of the most telling examples of Doyle and how he was impacted by Darwinianism is of course Sherlock Holmes. Holmes rejects any pseudoscientific explanation. He always finds a logical explanation for everything, and in many ways this is a very fundamental bedrock that Darwinian thought gave to the late Victorians. Sherlock Holmes would most certainly have been a Darwinian. Certainly it's logical. He follows this logical path. He follows this scientist path. Holmes is at base. He brings scientific detective work into the forefront, and the detective as scientist comes directly out of this whole new scientific method of thought that comes from Darwinian thinking. Yeah, Doyle's The Lost World. It's not the first story to deal with dinosaurs surviving into the modern world. I think the very first one may have been Journey to the Center of the Earth with Jules Verne, but this one has a lot of connections with Darwinian theory, because in the story, the ape men who exist in the Lost World are definitely proto-humans. They are in conflict with the human beings, and we see this evolutionary theory, which it doesn't really exist in other works of this nature or this early. Because you don't want to, you'll have them, you cannot have this kind of Lost World story today without the proto-humans. Land of the Lost, you've got the Chaka and his people, and I forget what the Pekuni. You have this in almost all these stories, and they really relate back to Doyle's Lost World. And Doyle, as I had said earlier, was not a fan of anthropologists, archaeologists. He had been belittled by some, and it's very possible, and a lot of people believe that Doyle perpetrated a hoax by burying some bones, and it becomes this. In there, I have seen the evidence for this conspiracy that Doyle's buried these bones that tricked, certain archaeologists, anthropologists into thinking that these ancient humanoids had existed in Britain. But and it does seem plausible that he may have done it because it is the people that were, having a little fun with him over his fairy thing and over the spiritualism. But in a lot of ways, this book, sort of repudiates that kind of science because these dinosaurs are living millions of years out of there with no evolutionary change. They're still the dinosaurs that people, recognize, were recognized in 1912 when this was published. But Doyle is certainly not above using Darwin's theories to sell a book, in which he certainly does in Lost World. And of course, Lost World is a template for, Jurassic Park, although I will say that Jurassic Park, and I'll say this later, really connects to some of the other stories from Darwinian stories. But this Lost World idea, this recreation of the dinosaur, this finding of these creatures from the Lost World, certainly fits into the Darwinian mindset, and then we see this, over and over again throughout history when this trope is being, we're going to have a Jurassic World movie out very soon, and it comes directly from this, and this is obviously inspired by, Darwin and the Origin of Species. Probably the most important impact of Darwin on horror, any type of horror, modern horror, Victorian horror, Gothic horror, is the bringing about of the scientific method into horror. Darwinian theory, while there are still werewolf stories, there were many werewolf stories in the Victorian era and before it. And if there are Victorian books on werewolves before Darwin's theory came out, there were people in France that still believed, that werewolves were, stalking the countryside of France. I can't remember the name of the book, but there's an entire book from the Victorian period about, looking for werewolves. Darwin killed the werewolf in a lot of ways. The wolf man becomes the ape man. We move away from this idea of the humanistic wolf and move toward this idea of the humanistic ape, or that men can degenerate into these ape-like creatures. And this brings us to, the most famous example of that, that is Robert Louis Stevenson. Robert Louis Stevenson, he wrote all kinds of different novels, but he wrote one of the most famous horror novels of all time. And, to understand, he was not going to write his Jekyll and Hyde. He was going to write a book about a werewolf, and the story of Jekyll and Hyde began as a werewolf story, and then in researching and working on the story, it changes into this bestial. And literally Hyde is in some ways a caveman. And Lewis, this is a reversion. If you read the book, he's reverting to this bestial nature, and the idea that human beings could revert to this bestial nature is a reversal of evolutionary theory. And Robert Louis Stevenson embraced that in the story and made one of the most famous, and I call this an ape-man story. It's not. Hyde is obviously not an ape-man. He's more of a uncivilized man. It's a man that is exhibiting, behavior that's really not that far in the past. Hyde would not be, out of place in, the 11th century. Hyde would, if you were to take, Hyde and place him in a setting of Vikings, or put him on board a Viking ship, he would not be out of place at all, especially once they arrived and began pillaging wherever they were pillaging. Hyde is a reversal of civilization. And a lot of these Victorian authors, that's what they're taking out of Darwin. They're seeing this. So evolution works in this certain way, and while it doesn't work this way, they're thinking that there's you can evolve upward into these civilized forms, or you could de-evolve into something like Hyde. Um, while that's not really true, not really how evolution works, it is how the popular conception of evolution worked. And Stevenson really taps into that fear. And this is a fear that, it permeates all these authors, every one of these authors, except maybe, well, no, because even Arthur Conan Doyle had stories that tapped into this, veneer of civilization, but they are not all that popular. But if you look at, H.G. Wells, or any of the others, Bram Stoker even, you look at these, that civilization is just this thin veneer, and that it could be wiped away at any moment. And this totally comes from their reading of Darwin. So I guess the question might be, where does this leave us today? If you look at the legacy of these stories, these stories, the legacy is all around us. Jekyll and Hyde is derives from werewolf stories, which are changed by Darwin, and you see stories today. The Incredible Hulk is the quintessential Jekyll and Hyde story. It's obviously that was a Jekyll and Hyde story. There's tons of Jekyll and Hyde stories. It's a very common trope. If you look at the time machine, and you can see tropes in that repeat themselves, throughout history. In fact, and it's still a very popular, story. It's been redone numerous times. The Island of Dr Moreau picks up, over and over again. Now we have, different types of Moreau stories where you're using DNA. In some ways, Jurassic Park is an Island of Dr. Moreau story. It's scientists making these creatures, that don't exist. And really, these are not dinosaurs as we would know them. They're their own version of dinosaurs. And it makes Jurassic Park into a very much an Island of Dr. Moreau sort of situation. And it plays out similar to that as well, the story. And you can find all these stories. I mean, Dracula, of course, still exists in all the vampire stories. But vampires have changed. You see a lot of these vampire stories where, vampires, they have a scientific reasoning behind the vampire. And then that, we could say that comes out of Darwin. I mean, it really does, because Darwin changed these horror stories from, this not so, fantastic and created this. We need to look into the scientific aspect of the horror. And anytime you see a scientifically based horror film, it's coming out of this genre that Darwin sort of kickstarts there in the 1850s, 1860s. So now this has been a really quick overview of my thesis that I wrote for my master's degree. You can read my thesis in the book A Wolf in Petticoats. It's in there with some other things I've written, and a friend of mine, Coleman, he also has several things in the book. The book is a series of essays. The longest essay is my thesis, and it's called A Wolf in Petticoats: Exploring Darwinism, Sexuality, and Gender in Late Victorian Gothic Horror. Now, we only discussed Darwinism, of course, in this. Sexuality and gender are in late Victorian Gothic horror is absolutely fascinating. Honestly, I should do a panel on that at some point, because and I'll bring up The Beetle again. That's a great book. Oh God, I'm forgetting who wrote it at this very moment. I don't have it in front of me. He only wrote like this one really famous book, but it really explores what it means to be a feminist in Victorian period, what it means to be female, what it means to be male in the Victorian period. The beetle is a well, how to explain this, a transsexual Egyptian priest who has come to London to exact revenge on a British gentleman who has done the beetle wrong. So you start with that premise and move on throughout the story. It really delves deeply into fears of transsexuality within Victorian society, fears of homosexuality in Victorian society. So I actually would encourage you to pick up my book about this, and I would encourage you to go out and find The Beetle and read it, because The Beetle was the best-selling book between the 1890s and 1912. In 1912, it was eclipsed by Dracula, and it never recovered. You can find it free in some places. I'm sure a lot of the free book repositories, it's in the public domain. I actually thought about doing an annotated version of it at one point, but I haven't gotten around to doing it yet. But I really advise you to pick up that book. And there are other. That's the book that's the most, absolutely gets to the point. But Wolf in Petticoats, we explore Clements Houseman's book, The Werewolf. And The Werewolf is about a female werewolf. And I write a lot about female werewolves in this book, because the female werewolf, in some ways, comes close to eclipsing the female vampire in its sexuality. It's a different type of sexuality. It's a more basic, primal sexuality from the wolf. In Houseman's book, the wolf is a female who is very, very, intent on having one of these two brothers, and she has basically killed off the rest of the family. It's a wonderful story, and it's a short read, so if you haven't read it, you should go back and read that as well. But pick up this book if you really are interested in these topics. This explains the topics. I'll give you books that I haven't even talked about that are good reads. Arthur Conan Doyle has a few had a werewolf story, not a novel, that he wrote, and I think I talk about that in there as well. So I hope you've enjoyed this panel, and have a good day.